The passengers on Flight 237 were settling in for a routine journey when an unexpected moment turned the trip into something unforgettable. As the flight attendants made their way down the aisle, serving passengers with warm smiles, one elderly black woman in a neatly pressed blue suit reached out for her meal. But instead of the usual polite service, she was met with an icy stare. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't serve people like you," the flight attendant said, her voice laced with something cold and dismissive. The older woman's hands trembled slightly as she pulled them back, her face unreadable. Murmurs spread through the nearby passengers, but no one spoke up. Across the aisle, a sharply dressed man, her son, watched the interaction closely, his jaw tightening. He had expected kindness, respect. What he witnessed instead was blatant discrimination. But what the flight attendant didn't know was who she had just insulted. As the tension thickened, the son slowly stood up, his presence commanding attention. The moment of truth was coming, and when it did, it would leave everyone on that flight, especially the flight attendant, completely speechless. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing around as if searching for support. But the passengers were no longer distracted by their books or conversations. All eyes were on her now. The murmurs grew louder as more people started to recognize the elderly woman. Some passengers pulled out their phones, whispering among themselves. The son took a step closer, his voice calm but unwavering. "You judged her without even knowing who she is," he said. "But let me tell you something. You're about to regret that choice." The flight attendant swallowed hard, her posture stiffening. "Sir, I was just following standard procedure," she replied, her voice slightly shaky now. "If there was a misunderstanding—" "A misunderstanding?" The son interrupted, letting out a dry chuckle. His mother remained silent, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Something that spoke of experience, of battles fought long before this moment. Meanwhile, a few rows back, a middle-aged man leaned forward, studying the elderly woman closely. His eyes widened as recognition dawned on him. He turned to the person beside him and whispered, "That's her. I saw her on the news last year." The energy in the cabin shifted. This was no ordinary passenger. The whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged glances, others leaned in to get a better look at the elderly woman. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her confident stance beginning to waver. She could feel the weight of the stares, the unease in the air. But she still didn't understand. Why was everyone suddenly acting as if this woman was someone important? The son took a slow breath, controlling the storm brewing inside him. He had spent his life watching his mother handle moments like this with grace. But today, he wasn't going to let it slide. "You should know," he said, his voice low but commanding. "The woman you just disrespected has done more for people than you can imagine." A man a few rows back suddenly spoke up, his voice filled with awe. "I knew I recognized her. She's the woman who—" He stopped himself, realizing the weight of his words. The flight attendant's face paled as she glanced back at the woman she had dismissed so easily. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, unaware of the tension unfolding below. But down in the cabin, the moment was reaching its peak. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her notepad, her confidence now replaced by uncertainty. She glanced at the elderly woman again, this time with something different in her eyes, not just confusion, but fear. Around the cabin, the energy had shifted. More passengers murmured, some nodding in recognition. A few even pulled out their phones, scrolling quickly, trying to confirm what they were beginning to suspect. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a voice from the front of the plane cut through the air. "Excuse me," a deep authoritative tone called out. Heads turned as another airline staff member, an older man in a captain's uniform, stepped forward. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the situation before landing on the elderly woman. The moment he saw her, his expression changed completely. Shock, then realization, then something almost like guilt. The flight attendant looked at him, silently pleading for backup, but he didn't move to support her. Instead, he slowly removed his cap, his hands unsteady. "Ma'am," his voice was barely above a whisper. I had no idea you were on board." The entire cabin fell silent again. Whatever was about to happen next, no one was prepared for it. The flight attendant's breath hitched as she looked between the captain and the elderly woman. The passengers were watching with wide eyes, waiting for an explanation. The captain took a step forward, his voice shaking slightly. "Ma'am, it's truly an honor to have you on this flight. If I had known sooner—" He trailed off, glancing at the stunned flight attendant, whose face had turned pale. The elderly woman finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "And if you had known sooner, would I have been treated any differently?" The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The flight attendant's lips parted, but no words came out. She knew the answer, and so did everyone else. Just then, a passenger at the back gasped, holding up her phone. "She's a civil rights attorney. She fought a major case last year and won." More gasps filled the cabin. Whispers turned into recognition. This woman wasn't just important. She had dedicated her life to fighting for justice. The son stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You never know who you're disrespecting," he said. "You judged her without a second thought." The flight attendant looked down, ashamed, realizing she had just insulted a woman who had likely defended people just like her. The elderly woman sighed, her gaze softening. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I need people to do better." The plane remained silent, the weight of her words settling in. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the captain did something no one expected. He turned to the elderly woman and said, "Ma'am, would you do us the honor of speaking to the passengers? I think we all have something to learn today." A murmur of agreement swept through the cabin. The flight attendant took a shaky breath, stepping aside as the elderly woman stood. This flight had started as just another trip, but now it had become a lesson no one on board would ever forget. The elderly woman looked around the cabin, seeing the anticipation in the passengers' eyes. She had spent her life using her voice to fight for justice, and now, in this unexpected moment, she knew she had one more lesson to share. She took a deep breath and spoke. Respect should never be based on status, appearance, or assumptions. It should be given freely to everyone. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled the entire plane. The passengers listened intently, some nodding, others deep in thought. The flight attendant stood quietly, her expression full of regret. The son placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. This wasn't the first time she had changed lives with her words, and it wouldn't be the last. The captain, still standing nearby, gave her a respectful nod. "Thank you," he said. As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Strangers exchanged small smiles, kindness lingering in the air. The flight attendant, humbled, approached the elderly woman. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and this time it was sincere. The elderly woman simply smiled. "Just do better." And with that, the lesson was learned.